On the last GIGACHAD story, we witnessed the rise of a great Umayyad Caliphate under the descendants of a Berberized Viking dynasty. When Haesteinn was assassinated, his son Ragnar became an ambitious conqueror who created a sprawling kingdom from the edge of the Sahara to Lisbon and Sardinia. When the great Ragnar passed away, his sons divided the kingdom, and his daughter's fates were indeterminate. Only Tora, who was married to Saifullah Umayyad, struck out on her own to find her fate. After giving birth to the twins Ibrahim and Vigdis, though, she and her husband would be struck down through a cruel fate that left the infant twins in the hands of the mostly Arab Muslim followers in their parents' camp. Over time, these followers would guide the fated twins to Arabia, and Ibrahim grew into a chivalrous knight known for his work in fending off Turks and Iranians looking to conquer the Levant. He was eventually propped up as the Lord of Aleppo and went on to create the empire you see now. His grandson, Yaqub, would transform his empire into a caliphate and create a new school of Sunni Islam, which he named after his famous grandfather. All seemed to be in place, with Yaqub having just recently minted some coins for his empire. Although he's more or less reached the end of his reign, he's got one thing left to do. Constantinople, the great city on the Black Sea, must be conquered, one way or another. The Christian world is in a devastating chaos on account of the rise and fall of the Russian Empire some decades ago and the crushing presence of the Ibrahimid Caliphate. The Byzantines themselves were, a while ago, cannibalized by their Western Christian counterparts, leading to an era of warlords and exploiters controlling the former lands of the Byzantine Empire. Caliph Yaqub need only but send the word to have his army sweep Anatolia up into his empire, and that's exactly what it did. He started with the conquest of Mesopotamia, the Duchy in Armenia, which was something of a warning to the despot of Pontus. Mesopotamia was given to Kamran, Yaqub's preferred son, and then used as a staging ground to dethrone Zacharias of Pontus. The conquest of Pontus will see a massive bastion of Christian power in Anatolia come crashing down, which meant the despot would not easily give in. It was finally in March of 1072 that the kingdom fell, and the Arabian Empire stretched out to the Black Sea. The momentum continued though, as minor local lords along the northwestern coast of Anatolia were next to fall. Before long, Yaqub's armies arrived in Bithynia. Across the straits sat the City of World's Desire, which only motivated the men more to see its conquest. The Emperor of Constantinople, Cajetan the Stranger, is one of the original Crusaders that oversaw the complete dissolution of the once great Roman Empire. He's a Pelagian Catholic with absolutely no connection to this land aside from his greed to have destroyed it. The conquest of Constantinople away from him would likely be seen as a liberation in the eyes of most of the Greeks, although Yaqub had not yet made public his plans for the city. The Theodosian walls proved formidable, but seeing the itch in his men to see the city captured, Yaqub ordered an assault after his men Canals destroyed a section of the ancient walls, and then, in January of 1074, the city was occupied, and the emperor's heir put in chains. The Latin army was, at this time, on an expedition to northern Anatolia for some reason. Maybe they were hoping to get some loot from the countryside before being kicked out of Constantinople. Regardless, Yaqub's forces arrived from the east to take their enemy off guard and eradicated the Latin army, leaving no survivors. At the battle, the emperor surrendered control of Thrace, and with it surrendered the fate of the Greeks of Constantinople. This video is, as was advertised, a part 2 for the Haesteinn Caliphate GIGACHAD story, but it serves a dual purpose. As part of this story, I threw together a mod which I've named The Fall of Constantinople. It's a small mod that adds just one decision to the game with 4 outcomes. It allows you to decide what to do with Constantinople as a Muslim ruler. For those wondering, I put this mod together in about 8 hours total of work, and its entire purpose is to give this video a justification to exist. But it is nonetheless of high enough quality that I'm willing to publish it. By the way, for those wondering about the languages mod that I had cooking a while back, I ended up scrapping it and reimagining the ideas from it as a new mod, which is not yet done, but I'm going to put up this screenshot to give you an idea of what it'll be. Make of that what you will. Anyway, in May of 1074, when Yaqub secured control over Constantinople, he made his proclamation on the fate of the city. As a zealous, sadistic ruler, Yaqub felt it appropriate to put the sinful people of the city to the sword, and so completely sacked Constantinople. The army was allowed to take what they wanted and do what they wanted. The city was left as a pile of rubble. A tribal holding replaced the castle there, and neither the Theodosian walls nor the Hagia Sophia remained. From here on, the entire Haesteinning dynasty would have become known as the House of Despoilers, which means every child born to the family will gain the Despoiler of Byzantium trait. The riches of the city were distributed among the vassals, with the lion's share going to the Caliph. I think I'll reduce the gold amount for the release build of the mod because I realize we're recording this video that 25,000 gold is a bit much compared to the rewards of the other options. I won't spoil what you get from the other options, but personally, my favorite option is to renovate Constantinople, and once you download this mod and play with it a bit, you'll see why. Out of the ashes of Constantinople came a sense of great victory and achievement for the entire realm, but especially Yaqub, who has now done something to match himself to his father Ghazi and his grandfather Ibrahim. He's going to pass this mantle of responsibility on to his own son, Kamran, who has been practicing his governance in Mesopotamia. Just under a year later, Yaqub passed away at the age of 69, nice, and left the realm in the hands of his son, Kamran. In Kamran, there is a huge pressure to do something great. He fully intends to make of himself something equally amazing, if not even more. His father broke the Eastern Christians, but Kamran intends to break down Western Christianity. Rarely does a lineage have such a decorated series of members as the Ibrahimid clan, and its beginnings with an orphaned knight of honor. Rarer still does such a lineage survive the jealousy of its underlings, and yet so far, each successive Ibrahimid ruler has only proved more and more popular. Kamran in particular is an extremely gifted ruler who has come to power at a perfect age. He's neither so young to be inexperienced, nor is he so old to be out of touch. He's made his ambitions for the realm clear. Kamran will bring about the total destruction of his Christian rivals, and along the way, bring his empire to its peak. But first, it's time for a little feasting. In case you're wondering who that Caliph Musa is, that's the Ash'ari Caliph. I didn't notice it, but at some point an Ash'ari character came to control a holy site and reformed their own caliphate. It's really no big deal, but just funny. It's like a little brother Caliph alongside the realm Ibrahimi Caliph. Anyway, after the feast, Kamran took some pilgrimages, as was customary for the Arabian emperors, and he even attended university in Jerusalem while he was still bald from his shaving in Mecca. Now it's time to get down to business. To defeat the Catholics, Kamran will need the best of the best in his ranks. He's hosting a tournament in Damascus with the promise that knights who distinguish themselves will be given the opportunity to earn the prestige of sacking Rome. Of course, using his armor and mace, which he inherited all the way down from his great-great-grandmother Kora, he was able to win every contest himself, but the semi-finalists at least were relatively competent knights. Kamran is no mere brute though. He even won the board games in his competition, and without any tyrannical disqualifications either. With his best knights hand-picked for the job, the incursion into Italia began, with Sicily to be the first conquest. From Tunis to Sicily is a relatively short journey, and the Duchess of Sicily, Aegida the Greek, isn't exactly a martial powerhouse. She tried to negotiate her way out of the war with her 18 diplomacy skill, but it's hard to let such a horrifically ugly creature possibly go without a declaration of war. Small footnote as well, Malta was itself independent and also conquered with no fanfare. Before continuing the conquest, Kamran took his time in Sicily to understand the land. Some call him a fool for being so cautious, but he only wished to ensure that no disaster could send his efforts astray. He inspected Messina to quell its local population and find good spots for ports and army camps to help his eventual move into the Italian peninsula. It was while inspecting the land that he would formally become a conqueror. His people could see that all of his posturing of Christian eradication was no mere political speech, but a true intention. The realm stood behind him, ready to bring about a new world. The Caliph returned to Damascus and took care of some internal affairs before considering how to deal with Italy. Being a zealous man, Kamran is always looking for pious guidance on how to fight his foes, and so, again, rather than act rashly, he took a pilgrimage to Baghdad. The Caliph studied up on his Quranic Arabic and found himself to be quite the scholar. The Greeks of Anatolia developed a new respect for Kamran after this, looking at him as one of the legendary philosopher kings that Plato often wrote about. In this Caliph, many Greeks despaired, as they were a conquered people, yet they also looked on with curiosity. Kamran enjoyed reading Greek works, but never put them above the guidance he knew he could get from Allah. Were he to dive too deeply into the ancient Greek works, he might find himself swayed by them, so he avoided reading them in large quantities. Instead, he spent some time conquering in the east, as much of Iran still wasn't quite under his control. Over time, the frontier governorates of Iraq had come to conquer past the Zagros Mountains, but it wasn't quite enough of Iran to properly call the region conquered. Inevitably, there was an Orthodox uprising in western Anatolia around April of 1091, which showed that not every Greek had such a curiosity for what could be their philosopher king. Nonetheless, like any king would do, Kamran put the rebels to the sword and ensured his people that so long as they not rebel, they will not be harmed. After all, Islam had within it already protections for the peoples of the book in reference to Christians and Jews. Throughout the recent generations of caliphs, legend after legend was told of their great piety, and on account of that, many legendary shrines stood across the Levant, in monument to the great caliphs that inspired them. Each of these shrines gives 5 more years of life expectancy, by the way, and that can result in some very interesting outcomes, which was more thoroughly explored by Hovalax in his Immortality video, which I'll link to in the description. Anyway, as punishment for the Christian uprisings in Anatolia, the caliphal armies swept across the rest of Anatolia and brought the entire region under its control, except for the west coast, which was ruled by the Italians. Because Italy is the next target for conquest in general, Kamran didn't want to create a truce that would prevent him from conquering the actual region of Italy. In the following years, Kamran spent a lot of time traveling and seeing far-off places. This is mostly because he was interested in seeing the great monuments of the world and bringing his children with him. The world is full of wonders, and he knows that he isn't in any rush to conquer Italia. After all, as of 1109, Kamran is 64 years old and still feels great. He's been to India, to England, and to many other places, slowly improving his skills with each visit. Some of his vassals wondered why he was being so cautious, but he assuaged their concerns, telling them that with each passing year, the Christians grow more and more anxious at the thought of their subjugation. Letting that anxiety fester will make them even more vulnerable. Even after saying that though, Kamran surprised the court with a declaration of jihad against southern Italy, spurring every righteous Muslim to take up arms and destroy the southern Italians. In terms of answering why I was so sheepish on declaring wars, by the way, the honest answer is that I was just enjoying using the Monument Expedition activity to get some cool characters and skill upgrades. You know, when I reviewed Wandering Nobles, I think I gave it a lower score than I should have. These activities are quite good in my opinion. Regardless, the jihad for Sicily went amazingly, with many Muslims sending their best men to fight in a great war. Legendary battles, featuring literally hundreds of knights like the Battle of Amalfi in October of 1112, saw chaotic bloodbaths painting their Italian soil a deep crimson, but each and every battle nonetheless saw a Muslim victory. About a year after that battle, the occupations in Sicily continued, and eventually the Christians did surrender in November of 1113. Rome itself, the Eternal City, sat just across a thin border which Kamran himself went to inspect. Papal forces lined up along Tivoli, ready for war at any moment, but Kamran, his ever-patient self, simply waited. He brought no armies to Tivoli, only himself and his entourage. This 70-year-old man still found the time to personally attend to his subjects in even the most faraway regions of his empire. Once he was done inspecting, he simply went home, baffling the papal border guards. A few years later though, Kamran finally did arrive with an army. He declared war to conquer all of Latium and did so quite easily. The Pope didn't receive much of any support from the Catholics of Europe, for they felt there was no stopping the force of nature that is the Caliphate. The ensuing chaos of the loss of Rome led to the total collapse of even the Latin Empire in 1119, which meant that there were no more Christian empires left, except for the Scandinavians. The Norsemen were a bit far away though, and more or less irrelevant to the politics of the Caliphate. With the end of the Latin Empire, there came a wave of conquests across Greece. Order had to be restored, and the various Arab lords of Anatolia would be the ones to do it. By 1124, the entire Aegean Sea fell under caliphal control, and Kamran himself used that momentum to lead his men on another campaign for further conquest in Romagna and Italy. In 1127, all that remained of Italia were the kingdoms of Venice and Italy, alongside a few holdouts from Sardinia. Rather than sit and watch this happen, the Pope declared a new crusade to reclaim Romagna with the support of what remained of the Catholic world. This is their last chance to stop the Arabian lords from dominating the heart of Christendom. Akin to the Great Jihad for Sicily, this crusade saw immense battles with Arab victories across the board. It's hard to compete with these battle-hardened men who've been fighting and winning for decades now. Each retired veteran would pass his skills and discipline onto the new recruits, who would iterate upon and improve those lessons through their own experience. Meanwhile, in the Christian armies, every boy pressed into the service had no guidance beyond who to kill. The crusade was swiftly repelled in 1131, with battles like the slaughter at Ravenna really showing the magnitude of Christian ineptitude on the field. In some ways, there was guilt in victories like these. Each war with the Christians saw the age of the enemy getting lower and lower. Some of the men on the field stood in their ranks without beards and wearing an armor that did not fit, clearly inherited from their larger fathers. Where's the glory in mowing down children? Casualty counts like 70,000 are just unimaginable to most of the men on the Arab side, and yet the bloodied fields of Ravenna left no room for imagination. The stench and pestilence, they both gave an omen of a curse to come. Before despair could overtake the armies of Arabia, Kamran spoke to his men and emphasized the fact that although they may be invading, these Christians are the ones resisting their righteous wars. Where the Arabs rule, there is great peace and prosperity, there is tolerance, and there is innovation beyond anything these Latins have been able to achieve. He did a little victim blaming, and more or less pinned the guilt for the deaths of these boys on their selfish lords, which the army did accept, but not too enthusiastically. Rather than allow that, Kamran made a promise instead to his men. Once Italia is conquered and the Pope made to submit to Islam, then the wars will stop. No more slaughter and no more war. Stories of the great wars and battles of Italia spread far and wide across the realm, and often Morocco, a sect of Sunni Muslims known as the Almohades, began their work to proselytize a sort of Islam centered on warfare. If anything, it was actually quite agreeable to the interpretations of Islam presented by the Ibrahimi school, except that Kamran feared it would create a competing caliphate which might lead to a new fitna. Just about 300 years ago, the Abbasids faced a fitna over the competing caliphs Mutaz and Mustasin, after the Caliph al-Muntasir failed to pick an heir. The Anarchy at Samarra, it was called, and although it was short, the unrest of the time would lead to the end of caliphal authority in Iran and the Zanj slave rebellion. As a learned man, Kamran knew all about such events, and so worked to put down the Almohades as quickly as possible. Despite fears of an Almohade Caliphate, Kamran continued his wars in Italy, this time against Venice. He would be bisecting the kingdom with a holy war for Lombardy. He also completed his conquest of Sardinia, which had remained an independent island for far too long. While waiting out the truces for his last conquests, Kamran went on a trip to India, visiting much of Tibet and Central Asia along the way. He was starting to become a legend across even India, as he entered the subcontinent with a welcome from the Indian lords there. By now, Kamran is, if you believe the sources, 94 years old and showing no signs of ailing. Some men just don't show their age like others do, I suppose, but Kamran is really something special. Many people across the world are wondering if he'll make it to 100 years old, while others are skeptical that he's even still alive. Conspiracy theorists believe he was replaced by a body double long ago and is being puppeteered by some sinister force, the identities of which range from devil worshippers to pagans and other unsavory peoples. Nonetheless, despite the long trip back home from India, Kamran celebrated his 95th birthday like he always did, with some prayers and a request for Allah that he be allowed another year on this earth so he could serve just a little bit longer. With his return to Damascus in 1142, Kamran's truce with Venice ended, and so the war continued, followed by the conquest of Corsica and finally the conquest of what little land remained in Sardinian hands in Italy. In 1145, just 3 years after his trip to India, Kamran formally dissolved the Catholic papacy. Yet the Caliph was not cruel like his father Yaqub. Kamran made a promise: no more wars after the dissolution of papal power. Gregorius, the monk, now a follower of Islam, was recruited to the court and granted a holding in Romagna to govern and retire in. There's no reason to rile up the Christians and mistreat their spiritual leader. After all, in Catholic theology, this man with his cute hat is the representative of Jesus, their Lord. Jesus is a respected figure in Islam too, and so he let this supposed vicar of Christ live out his days in relative tranquility, albeit without much power. The two even became friends, as Gregorius couldn't help but enjoy the immense intellectual mind of his conqueror. That same year that the two became friends, Kamran celebrated his 100th birthday. He changed up his normal birthday celebrations for this one. He instead thanked Allah for giving him all these years to prove his worth to him. He did not wish for more years, but only that when his time comes, it come with joy and peace. Although the various governors of Arabia may choose to fight their wars, and there may be the occasional foolhardy lord looking to challenge the caliphate, Kamran himself has renounced war. His missionaries had, in good time, brought the Almohades back to the proper Quranic interpretation, emphasizing that really, Ibrahimi Islam has served their goals in pretty much the exact same way they would have wanted under the Almohade Caliphate. Kamran has ruled for just about 70 years now, and from the beginning of his father Yaqub's reign to now, has been labeled the Kamran Century. The entire world order has entirely evolved under these two men, and the Caliph quite enjoys that label. You know, Kamran is a very special Caliph, and that's because he is truly different from his ancestors. Where each of the Caliphs before him in the Ibrahimid lineage had their own little hobbies and activities, Kamran was by far the most dedicated to his realm out of any previous lord. He pursued war only insofar as it was the will of his people. He visited his territories in service of the people and lords there. He traveled far and wide across the known world only in search of knowledge, skill, and greater servants for the court. Unlike any before him, Kamran did not engage in any particular hobby. He prayed, he worked, and he only consumed what he needed to so he could do those things. In In the year 1150, Kamran turned 105 years old, and the grumbling of vassals who lost money on bets that he wouldn't make it were the only noises of discontent in the empire. When a lord rules for this long, they become truly emblematic of that realm. The Caliph spent most of his time listening to his subjects' pleas and complaints, swiftly addressing them, and he visited interesting sections of the empire for inspections or just hikes. He also worked with the Chancellor to integrate more Byzantine kingdoms into his empire, although he knew those integrations would go beyond his own life with near certainty. Before his death, he oversaw the integration of Pontus and Armenia into the kingdom and was working on the kingdom of Georgia. Finally though, the man, the myth, the legend, the Caliph, Kamran, passed away in November of 1151 at the age of 106. He lived so long that many had forgotten that he even had heirs, but indeed he did. His youngest and only living son, Daud, became the next Caliph, taking the throne at 66 years old. The Kamran Century has come to an end, and with it, so has this story. I'm sure I could continue it, but I'm done now. The highlight of this video is that to help pursue the story, I did indeed put together that Fall of Constantinople mod. If you like this story, make sure first of all that you've watched the first part, because that sets up most of this story, and make sure you check out the mod, so you too can burn down Constantinople, or perhaps do some other things. I added a couple new things not shown in this video to the mod, by the way, so there's lots more to discover over there. Link in the description. Thank you for your time.